Elfriede, a 70-year-old woman, was flying from a small town in Germany to Berlin. She had lived alone for years, a woman filled with traces of the past. Her life had been shaped by old traditions and strict rules. Over time, Elfriede became alienated from society and struggled to connect with most people. Though everyone saw her as an old and grumpy woman, she had found a way to live in her own world, listening to the echoes of the past. Today, she couldn't help but focus on the black man sitting next to her on the plane. The man was tall, calmly looking out the window. As usual, Elfriede instinctively perceived him as a foreign presence. Her mind immediately formed a judgment. He was a foreigner. He was different. "Are you thinking that you're uncomfortable on this plane?" she wondered while observing his movements. One way or another, people these days really don't know anything. Then, for a moment, thoughts lost in the shadows of Elfriede's old Germany returned. "Look at these people," she thought. "They act as if we are all equal, but reality is different. They have never been equal to us." As the plane took off, Elfriede's prejudices and fear of the unfamiliar grew rapidly. She examined the man carefully. His leather suitcase was simple, but carried a noticeable brand. But as Elfriede always said, people like this don't belong in places like these. After a while, she couldn't resist and decided to speak to the man sitting next to her. Slowly, with a sneer and a sharp tone, she said, "You must think I have no idea about the places you people are forced to go, don't you?" She sighed deeply. "You don't always deserve to be here. We should all be equal on these planes, but some of you simply aren't worthy of it." The man heard Elfriede's words but didn't react. He noticed the harshness and prejudice in her tone, but he simply closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. He remained silent for a few seconds, so silent that Elfriede couldn't even understand what he was thinking. "I know what you mean," he finally responded, this time calmly but with confidence. "But let me tell you something. Don't act based on what everyone else does. You can't change how you see life or people. It's more important to see with your own eyes." Elfriede was shocked. His words shook her to the core. "What do you mean?" she asked. "Are you saying I can change something? What can a woman my age possibly change?" The man slightly tilted his head, turned to her, and, with even more composure, continued. "Sometimes the most powerful changes come from the quietest moments, and some people don't even realize the change." Elfriede pondered the man's words. Just then, the pilot's announcement came through, his voice briefly delivering some flight information. But something was stirring in Elfriede's mind. The man, he was so different. His words evoked something beyond her old prejudices. Could just one person teach her such a sharp lesson? They remained silent for a while longer. Elfriede's gaze drifted back to the black man once more. But this time, instead of seeing him as a stranger, she realized he wasn't so different after all. He was just another person. A short time later, the plane began its descent. Through the sleepless hours, Elfriede had learned something from her thoughts. Before deboarding, she finally turned to the black man. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice now softened. The man replied with a slight smile. "John. John Carter." "Nice to meet you, John," Elfriede said, this time with sincerity. "Sometimes things or people teach us more than we realize. Without knowing it, the human heart can change." John smiled. "People often only see themselves, Elfriede, but I believe we should all try to see through the eyes of others as well." As they walked toward the terminal, Elfriede reflected on John's words. She felt as if all the years she had lived, all her prejudices, had crumbled in just a few minutes. But at that moment, as she thought deeper, she realized who John really was. John was an FBI agent. Elfriede's eyes welled up as she turned back one last time to look at the man beside her. "Sometimes, people touch our lives without even knowing who they truly are," she murmured. Glancing once more through the plane window, she lifted her head and followed the path ahead. The moment she learned John's identity, the resentment and prejudices within her seemed to vanish. She was still trying to come to terms with the transformation unfolding inside her. As Elfriede took one last look at John, she felt an unusual heaviness in her body. Walking toward the terminal, every heartbeat seemed weightier. The burdens of all the years she had lived stacked upon her like a mountain. She took slow steps, just as every memory from her past slowly wrapped around her. But this time, something was different. She could feel John's words so deeply that she knew she would never forget them. As she stepped into the crowded terminal, everything around her suddenly blurred. Looking ahead, the world became hazy. Every person around her reduced to nothing more than a silhouette. People smiled, rushed to their destinations, but for a fleeting moment, she felt an emptiness within her. Elfriede realized the walls she had built around herself over the years. They were so thick that even her own loneliness had been trapped behind them. But John had seen those walls, and with just a few words, he had started to break them down. For a brief moment, Elfriede was shaken by the fact that John was an FBI agent. How strange it was. A man could exist in society for years, hidden in plain sight. Yet learning who he was didn't matter nearly as much as the way his words had touched her heart. John wasn't just a government officer, he was a person, a friend, and maybe an angel who had appeared in Elfriede's life at the most unexpected time. Elfriede's mind was in turmoil. Slowly, she slid her hands into her pockets and lowered her head. At that moment, she felt the tears slipping down her face. When had she last cried? When had she last felt such a deep ache that touched her soul? All her life, she had learned to hide her heart. But this man, with just a few sentences, had reminded her of a long-forgotten feeling, the pain of being wounded, but also the possibility of healing. Her eyes drifted back to memories of her lost lover. In her youth, she had believed anything was possible, but life had hurt her so deeply that she had learned to bury the pain over the years. She had stopped believing in love, fearing the agony of loss that still lingered within her. Elfriede quickly wiped her tears, but the emptiness and regret inside her lingered as she walked on. Suddenly, she came to a stop in the middle of the crowd. Everything moved around her at full speed, yet none of it seemed meaningful. How alone she was. She could stand there fearless, but inside she was so broken, something was missing. And then, for just a moment, a voice approached her. "Elfriede," someone called out. She flinched and lifted her head. Her eyes were still blurry from the impact of what John had realized and said. But this time, the voice came from another woman. Elfriede saw an old friend. The woman took a few steps closer to recognize her. Elfriede struggled to smile. "What happened, Elfriede?" the woman asked with a worried expression. "It looks like something has deeply affected you. Why are you crying?" Elfriede averted her eyes and fell into a brief silence. She felt the pain inside her, but it was so deep that expressing it seemed almost impossible. What could she say? Was she weak enough to let everything she had bottled up for years spill out all at once? Suddenly, a cry echoed from the depths of her heart. The feeling of knowing that someone truly cared about her, that someone approached her as a human being. It was such a simple yet profound emotion. "Life can be so harsh sometimes," Elfriede said, unable to hold back her tears. Looking at the woman, she continued, "We judge so easily, without even knowing a person, without understanding who they are." The woman's expression shifted, shaken by Elfriede's words. Elfriede's eyes gleamed as if reflecting the truth of the things that had shaped her life. The things she had always misunderstood and feared. Maybe breaking someone's heart, taking something from them, doesn't make you stronger. I learned that, Elfriede added, her voice filled with pain. The woman wrapped her arms around Elfriede. At that moment, Elfriede once again felt she was not alone. A stranger, an FBI agent, had taken something from her, and yet he had touched her life. A stranger had noticed her at the most unexpected time, during one of life's most difficult moments. Elfriede thought about John again, His words still lingered in her mind. Slowly, she took another step forward. She knew she could change. But maybe this change was a chance that had come after many long years. The plane journey had ended, but Elfriede's journey was far from over. As she walked slowly toward the terminal exit, her mind was still fixated on John's face and words. That man had managed to shake her perspective on life with just a few sentences. But there was something about him, the calm expression on his face, the sorrow in his eyes, and the wisdom mixed with gentleness that echoed in Elfriede's mind. How could a man who had seen so much pain still be so kind? John paused at the terminal exit, glancing at his phone as a message came in. He lowered his head for a moment, took a deep breath. "There was a woman on the plane," he said, averting his gaze. "She said a lot of things to me, hurtful things, about my race, my existence. But instead of showing her how much she had wounded or angered me, I just tried to make her see how easy, yet wrong, it is to judge people." Michael listened carefully, holding John's hand. "Why do you do this, John? Why do you always feel like you have to protect yourself? Let them understand you. Tell them your story. Sometimes people see you behind a wall and they don't even know who you are." John nodded slightly. "Sometimes telling my story is so hard because before anything else, I am a black man. They see me as a threat. Then I'm an FBI agent. They don't trust me. And then I'm gay. People judge me solely by my identity. But all I want is to just be human. You get that? Being human should be enough." Michael felt the depth of John's words. "John, above all else, you are human. And sometimes, in this world, just being human is a challenge on its own. But know this, I will always be by your side." As John met Michael's eyes, he felt a fleeting moment of peace. Yet his thoughts still lingered on Elfriede. The judgment in her eyes had slowly softened during those quiet moments on the plane. John didn't know Elfriede's story, but he had felt it. She was fighting her own battles. Perhaps that was why he had responded to her words with patience rather than anger. Because John had learned that judging people on the surface was never enough to truly understand them. That night, as John and Michael sat down for dinner, John found it impossible to stop thinking about Elfriede. In her eyes he had seen the kind of pain the world had ignored for years. He had realized how lonely she was, Dot. And loneliness was something John had known all too well. To live in isolation because of your identity, to be invisible in society, to constantly fight just to exist. Meanwhile, Elfriede sat on a bench in the terminal. When she had found out John was an FBI agent, it had felt like a bucket of cold water had been dumped over her. She had treated him with such prejudice, only to learn that he was a hero. The realization filled her heart with a painful ache. Her eyes were still wet with tears, but this time it was a different kind of sorrow. She had spent years judging others to protect herself, but this time she had hurt someone without even knowing who they were. "Elfriede," she murmured to herself, "what have you done? Knowing how hard it is just to exist in this world, how could you treat someone like that? How could I be so blind?" These thoughts carved out a deep emptiness inside her. She had lived alone all her life, shielding her heart with the pain of those she had lost. She had chosen not to let anyone in. But now, a stranger's few words had begun to tear down the walls she had built over the years. That night, John spent the evening alone in his hotel room, Dot being black, being gay, being an FBI agent. These were deep and complex layers that shaped a person's identity, and sometimes it felt like he was lost between each layer. People judged him solely by his identity, never questioning what was in the depths of his eyes. Perhaps that was why he had gotten used to treating people coldly, hiding his emotions. That night, instead of lying on his bed, he sat by the window. The city lights gave him a distant peace in the silence of the night. The silence outside couldn't hear the screams inside John, but he tried to focus on his thoughts, taking a deep breath. "Who am I?" he thought. I am an invisible man. And perhaps the greatest struggle in his life was accepting his own identity. Once, he had dreamed big dreams for his life. He wanted to do something truly important, to have the power to change the world. But now, no matter how much he tried, he felt lost within everything. He had fought so many battles that he could no longer tell what was right or wrong. Every time he wanted to release the pain inside, societal norms and prejudices chained him like a collar. Elfriede, spending the night alone, deepened the turmoil inside her. Initially, the anger she felt toward John had now given way to heavy regret. The hardness and attempts to harden her heart that the years had given her had now returned like a boomerang. She had accumulated so much anger that every vulnerability, every wrong move, became a reflex to defend. Faye she once lived with a smile, but back then she was young. She needed a world to embrace love and life. Now she only feared growing old and being alone. In that moment, she realized how empty everything she had lived was. How much have I really lost, she thought, her eyes filling with tears. Years ago she had understood what love was, but now there was only emptiness in her heart. The years spent with people, her husband, her family, her children, had faded like silhouettes. Elfriede had looked for that emptiness outside herself, but nothing had brought her happiness. In what world was she living that she had become so distant from real human relationships? She had never understood that people were more than what they felt. Perhaps her greatest loss was that she had forced herself to feel lonely for all those years. Elfriede took a deep breath and turned her eyes towards John. What he had said had reminded her of the meaning of life for a moment. But meeting someone like John had been so difficult. There were so many Elfriedes in this world, people who sought love in their hearts but lived in fear, people who tried to understand others but were closed off to their judgments. John woke up with the first light of dawn. The hours he had spent awake through the night had worn him down further. One of the messages on his phone caught his attention. It was from Elfriede. He slowly picked up his phone and read, "John, forgive me. Sometimes treating people unfairly is nothing more than reflecting our own fears. I hope that one day I will understand just how strong your story is. You really made me realize that I need to remember that we are just human. I owe you this." After reading the message, John took a deep breath. On one hand, the sadness inside him deepened, but on the other, a glimmer of hope emerged. Maybe people could change when they gave each other a chance. Understanding each other was not something that could happen with just a glance or a few words. Communication was a battle won over time. The story is left open here because this moment was the first step toward change and understanding. Elfriede and John's lives had crossed, but both still had to continue their inner journeys. Elfriede's regrets and John's long-standing battles with his identity might have laid the foundation for a new beginning by touching each other. But this was something that could only be understood with time. She once lived with a smile, but back then she was young. She needed a world to embrace love and life. Now she only feared growing old and being alone. In that moment, she realized how empty everything she had lived was. How much have I really lost? She thought, her eyes filling with tears. Years ago, she had understood what love was, but now there was only emptiness in her heart. The years spent with people, her husband, her family, her children, had faded like silhouettes. Elfriede had looked for that emptiness outside herself, but nothing had brought her happiness. In what world was she living that she had become so distant from real human relationships? She had never understood that people were more than what they felt. Perhaps her greatest loss was that she had forced herself to feel lonely for all those years. Elfriede took a deep breath and turned her eyes towards John. What he had said had reminded her of the meaning of life for a moment, but meeting someone like John had been so difficult. There were so many Elfriedes in this world, people who sought love in their hearts but lived in fear, people who tried to understand others but were closed off to their judgments. John woke up with the first light of dawn. The hours he had spent awake through the night had worn him down further. One of the messages on his phone caught his attention. It was from Elfriede. He slowly picked up his phone and read, "John, forgive me. Sometimes treating people unfairly is nothing more than reflecting our own fears. I hope that one day I will understand just how strong your story is. You really made me realize that I need to remember that we are just human. I owe you this." After reading the message, John took a deep breath. On one hand, the sadness inside him deepened, but on the other, a glimmer of hope emerged. Maybe people could change when they gave each other a chance. Understanding each other was not something that could happen with just a glance or a few words. Communication was a battle won over time. The story is left open here because this moment was the first step toward change and understanding. Elfriede and John's lives had crossed, but both still had to continue their inner journeys. Elfriede's regrets and John's long-standing battles with his identity might have laid the foundation for a new beginning by touching each other. But this was something that could only be understood with time.